They didn't expose you, they rewrote you. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when someone lacks the power to control your actions, they often turn to the only tool left, shaping perception. This is not through China behavior, it is deeply psychological. It reflects what Carl Jung described as projection, the act of disowning one's own flaws and unconsciously assigning them to another. In this case, you became the canvas for traits they refused to confront within themselves. Notice how quickly the narrative formed. There was no careful examination of facts, no genuine curiosity about your side of the story. Instead, there was urgency, an almost desperate need to define you before you could define yourself. Why? Because ambiguity threatens those who rely on control. If people were to see you clearly, without distortion, the illusion they built would collapse. So they simplified you, reduced you, turned a complex human being into a convenient role, the villain. But here's where most people misunderstand the situation. Being cast as the villain is not always a sign of wrongdoing. It is often evidence of independence. You disrupted a dynamic, you refused to conform. You stepped outside of a role that benefited others but diminished you. And when you did that, the system around you reacted exactly as systems tend to react when challenged. It labeled the disruptor as the problem. This is why defending yourself often feels futile in the moment. You are not arguing against facts. You are arguing against a story people have already chosen to believe. And stories, once emotionally accepted, are remarkably resistant to logic. So the real shift doesn't begin with proving them wrong. It begins with understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because the moment you see it clearly, you stop internalizing it. You stop questioning your worth based on someone else's distortion. And in that clarity, something powerful emerges. Detachment. And once you detach from a false narrative, you take back the one thing they were trying to steal, your identity. While they were busy filling the air with accusations and half-truth, you made a decision that most people misunderstand. You became quiet, not out of weakness, not because you had nothing to say, but because you recognized something deeper about human nature. Not every battle deserves your voice. In fact, some battles are designed to trap you in endless reaction, to pull you down to a level where clarity is impossible. Silence, in this sense, is not absence. It is restraint. It is the conscious refusal to participate in chaos. And psychologically, this is where the real transformation begins. Because when you stop reacting externally, your energy is redirected inward. You begin to observe rather than absorb. You start to see patterns instead of just feeling pain. And that shift from emotional reactivity to conscious awareness is where strength is born. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of confronting the inner world, of turning inward to understand the unconscious forces shaping our lives. Your silence created that space, while others were focused on controlling the narrative outside. You were reconstructing the foundation within. You were examining your boundaries, your values, your blind spots. You were asking the kind of questions most people avoid because they require honesty, and this is why your silence unsettled them. Because they expected noise. They expected defense, explanation, perhaps even desperation. But what they encountered instead was distance, and distance removes control. When you are no longer easily provoked, no longer predictable in your reactions, you become difficult to manipulate. The very dynamic they relied on begins to dissolve. What looked like withdrawal was actually discipline. What appeared to be passivity was in reality strategic patience. You were not disappearing. You were refining, strengthening, becoming someone who no longer needed external validation to feel certain about their truth. And here is the paradox. The less you felt the need to prove yourself, the more your presence began to speak for itself. Because true power is not in what you say under pressure, it is in what you choose not to say at all. What becomes even more revealing in this process is not the accusation itself, but the speed at which people chose a side. Notice how quickly some individuals accepted the narrative without hesitation, without inquiry, without even a moment of doubt. That response is not so shiny. It exposes something fundamental about human relationships. Loyalty, when it is real, is grounded in understanding. But when it is superficial, it attaches itself to convenience, to emotion, to whatever feels easiest in the moment. And this is where a difficult truth emerges. Many of the people you thought were with you were only aligned with a version of you that was comfortable for them. The moment you stepped outside that version, when you became less predictable, less accommodating, less controllable, their allegiance weakened, not because you changed in some negative way, but because you no longer fit the role they had assigned to you. From a psychological perspective, this reflects a fragile sense of connection. People who lack inner clarity often outsource their judgment to the loudest voice in the room. They do not investigate, they absorb. And once they absorb a narrative, they defend it as if it were their own discovery. This is why betrayal in such moments feels so sharp. It is not just that people believed something false, it is that they did so without granting you the dignity of being understood. But here is the shift that changes everything. Instead of seeing this as loss, you begin to recognize it as revelation, because false loyalty cannot sustain itself under pressure. It requires stability, comfort, and the absence of challenge. The moment tension appears, it fractures. And while that fracture is painful, it is also clarifying. You start to see people not as they presented themselves, but as they truly are. You begin to understand that loyalty is not proven in agreement, but in discernment, in the willingness to pause, to question, to seek truth, even when it is inconvenient. And once you see that clearly, something inside you recalibrates. You stop chasing validation from unstable sources. You stop investing in connections that cannot withstand reality. Because in the end, it is better to stand alone in truth than to stand surrounded by people who are never truly standing with you at all. There is something deeply unsettling about time when you are standing in truth and being misunderstood. In the moment, it feels slow, almost indifferent, as if it refuses to intervene, while distortions spread unchecked. You may even feel the urge to accelerate the process, to explain, to correct, to force clarity into a situation that seems to resist it. But time does not operate on urgency. It operates on revelation. Because what words attempt to do quickly, time accomplishes thoroughly. It observes patterns. It exposes inconsistencies. It allows actions, not claims, to accumulate. And over time, those actions begin to contradict the very narrative that was constructed about you. Not through confrontation, but through contrast. The difference between who you are and what was said about you becomes too large to ignore. This is why restraint becomes such a powerful discipline. When you resist the impulse to constantly defend yourself, you create space for reality to emerge on its own terms. And reality, unlike perception, is difficult to manipulate indefinitely. People may believe a story for a while, especially if it aligns with their emotions or biases. But eventually, they begin to notice what doesn't add up. They see behavior that doesn't match the accusation. They feel a dissonance they cannot quite explain. From a psychological perspective, this is the moment where cognitive tension begins to break the illusion. The mind can only hold on to a false belief for so long when faced with consistent evidence to the contrary. And when that shift happens, it doesn't come with noise. It comes quietly, subtly. A reconsideration here, a doubt there, until the entire narrative starts to unravel. And this is the part most people never anticipate. Truth does not need to be aggressive to be powerful. It does not need to chase. It simply needs to remain consistent. While others may exhaust themselves maintaining an illusion, you remain anchored in what is real. And over time, that stability becomes undeniable. So instead of asking why truth takes tea, the better question is whether you have the patience to let it work. Because in the end, truth doesn't rush to defend you. It waits to reveal everyone. While they were focused on dismantling your image, something far more significant was happening. Quietly, steadily, almost invisibly. You are building a life that no narrative could contain. And this is the irony most people fail to grasp. Energy invested in growth compounds, while energy invested in destruction eventually exhausts itself. At first, the imbalance feels unfair. You see the effort they put into misrepresenting you, the attention they draw, the influence they seem to gain. And meanwhile, your work happens in silence, without applause, without immediate recognition. But psychological development has never been a spectacle. It is an internal process before it becomes an external reality. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, independent of external expectations and imposed identities, and what you went through forced that process. You were stripped of approval, distanced from familiar validation, and left with something far more valuable: the necessity to define yourself on your own terms. That is not a loss. That is transformation. So while they remain fixated on controlling perception, you shifted your focus to something real: your habits, your discipline, your direction. You began investing in areas of your life that could not be influenced by rumor or opinion. Skills improved, boundaries strengthened, perspective deepened, and slowly, without needing to announce it, your reality started to change. This is where the dynamic begins to reverse, because eventually, results speak in a language that narratives cannot override. People start to notice the gap, the difference between what was said about you and what you've actually become. And in that moment, the Sam, a story that once worked in their favor, begins to lose credibility. But more importantly, something changes within you. Your growth is no longer a reaction to what happened. It becomes your identity. You are no longer trying to prove them wrong. You are simply moving forward. And that is where the deepest shift occurs. Because when your focus turns from defending your name to building your life, you stop playing their game and start creating a reality they can no longer deny. And eventually, almost inevitably, the dynamic begins to shift. Not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but in a quiet reversal that only those paying attention can truly see. The same narrative that once elevated them starts to erode, and the image they constructed for you begins to dissolve under the weight of reality. This is the moment people often describe as the tables turning, but psychologically, it is something far more precise. It is the natural consequence of imbalance correcting itself, because no false structure can sustain itself indefinitely. It requires constant reinforcement, constant energy, constant agreement, and over time that becomes difficult to maintain. Contradictions surface, behavior exposes intention, and those who once seemed certain begin to experience doubt, not because you forced them to, but because reality left them no other option. At the same time, your position has fundamentally changed. You are no longer standing in reaction, no longer seeking validation. no longer entangled in the need to correct every misunderstanding. There is a distance now, a clarity that comes from having endured without losing your center. And that distance is what gives you power. Not power over others, but power over yourself, which is infinitely more stable. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of integrating one's shadow, of facing the uncomfortable truths within rather than projecting them outward. And this is where the contrast becomes undeniable. While you are forced into introspection, into growth, into self-confrontation, others remain fixed in projection. And over time, that difference becomes visible. One evolves, the other repeats. So when the roles begin to reverse, it is not about revenge. It is not about watching others fall. It is about recognizing that you are no longer defined by what happened. The narrative that once confined you has lost its influence, not because it was destroyed, but because you outgrew it. And that is the final shift, when you no longer need the tables to turn to feel at peace. Because true power is not in seeing others face consequences. It is in realizing you are no longer standing at the same table at all.